Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to your second installment of your Standard 4 screencast lectures. I have dubbed these the Bullets and Bombs lecture, even though there's really no bombs. The bullets are drastically different than what you guys think of as bullets. This is going to be the military strategy and important people and big battles and things like that screencast for the Standard. So what you see in front of you is really the first and most important challenge that the American colonial forces will face really throughout the American Revolution. You see that our Continental Congress, that's what CC stands for. Our Continental Congress doesn't have the power to tax the states. That's because the current government structure that is in place during the American Revolution is called the Articles of Confederation. We'll look a little bit more into this in Standard 5, but basically, to put it very broadly, the states are more powerful than the central government. So the central government, the United States government in this case, can request funds, but they can't actually compel the states to pay them. So the Continental Congress for the entirety of the war is going to basically just have to beg and scrap and kind of pull together by any means necessary the funds to hold the army together. And in a lot of cases, the soldiers simply aren't going to get paid. So due to this lack of funds, the advantages for Great Britain are pretty much anything that deal with money. The British have more people. They have a more advanced military. They pay their people much better. They can hire mercenaries. If you're ever confused about the advantages or disadvantages for the British and the Americans, just think, if money can buy it, the British have it. If money can buy it, the Americans most likely don't. It's pretty much that simple. Okay? So in order to actually make this army function, if you can't rely on your material, if you can't rely on your cannons and your naval ships and everything else, you need to rely on your people. So George Washington is going to be that first kind of charismatic leader that's ultimately going to hold the American Continental Army together. You see him kind of triumphantly crossing the Delaware, and this is the image that is put out of Washington. He's appointed, we're going to talk more about the Delaware here in a second, but he's appointed by the Second Continental Congress to lead the Continental Army, and at that point, this is a brand new force. Nobody has any idea how it's going to be funded. Nobody knows who's going to fight in it, but George Washington has decided is going to lead it. The big thing about Washington is that his strategy is never to militarily beat the British. His strategy is to stay in the field long enough to outlast the British. If the British get tired of funding the war, the Americans are going to win. And that's basically Washington's strategy. Don't fight prolonged engagements. Don't give General Howe or whomever, General Cornwallis, don't give them a chance to win a decisive victory against you and knock your army out of the field. If you can stay in the war, the Americans are still fighting, and that's what matters. Washington never really wants to win that big battle. Now, we'll talk about a few that the Americans do win, but originally, that's not really the Americans' goal. So, first real conflict that we see here is at Trenton. It takes place after the British have already really swept through New York. They've kind of swept through the majority of New Jersey. They're all about winning big battles in New England. They've done everything they've set out to do till this point. So, at this particular conflict, the American colonists, so the Continental Army, they're reeling from several defeats. It's Christmas Eve. The Hessian soldiers, who are British conscripts, they're British mercenaries, they're German, very well trained, very well equipped. They are camped right outside of Trenton. And nobody really expects there to be a battle. It's Christmas Eve, it's snowing, it's the middle of a storm. The Delaware River that you see right here is frozen. Not totally frozen, so you could walk across it, but big old ice chunks that would really like Titanic your little rowboat that you might want to try to cross the river in. Washington decides that before he goes into a winter camp, they need some type of victory. So he crosses the Delaware. He attacks the British conscripts, the Hessians, attacks them at Trenton, and they win. They win a decisive victory. They then bleed back across the Delaware, and they go into their winter camp at Valley Forge. Now, Valley Forge, this is important because of what happens at it. Now, it's a miserable winter. There's nothing pleasant about it, and we'll get to Saratoga here in a second. But there's nothing pleasant about it. There's disease everywhere. People are freezing to death. There's not enough winter clothes. The Continental Congress is unable to provide them with enough food to last through the winter. It's horrendously miserable. However, there are a couple of people there that are very important. The first one is Marquis de Lafayette. And the second is Baron von Steuben. These two guys, one French and one Prussian, they are two officers that are sent to the American colonies to help Washington train his militia and ultimately make them a better fighting force. Now, there's clips in the story of us, and there's another clip from the Mount Vernon series that you guys have access to on It's Learning that will give you a lot more insight into those two individuals. So I'm not going to talk about them specifically here, but make sure you go back and take a look at them. At this particular time period, Washington's force goes into Valley Forge, really an amateur ragtag group of people who are passionate but not very skilled. They come out of Valley Forge, a highly skilled modern army that is capable of maybe not standing toe-to-toe with the British, because the British still have a lot more money than the American colonists, but they can definitely, from a skill perspective, at least be respectable. So after Trenton, probably the most important battle of the American Revolution is the fighting that takes place at Saratoga. The big picture British goal here is try to split New England away from the rest of the American colonies. And the most effective and efficient way to do that is going to be to capture the Hudson River. So the plan is kind of hatched by the British High Command that an army out of New York is going to march north. General Howe is going to command that force, and he's going to march north in order to meet up with another British regiment that's marching south out of Canada, both forces moving along the Hudson River. And when they meet in the middle, the British will control that waterway and will effectively split the American colonies in two. On paper, sounds like a great idea. In practice, not so much. General Howe decides that he doesn't really want to go to New York. He thinks that capturing Philadelphia is a far more valuable prize, since Philadelphia is the capital of the American nation, the new nation. And he thinks that if he can get Philadelphia, the kind of the will to fight and the colonies will just crumble and the British will win. What Howe doesn't understand is that for a force like the American Continental Army, a capital city is not nearly as important. If London were to be captured by the French, the history in London and the value it holds to Englishmen would have a much larger effect on the morale of the country. For someone living in the American colonies, there really is no history of Philadelphia as the capital of this nation, and thus it's not viewed as being as important as, say, London, for example. So when General Howe moves north, fails to move north and moves on Philadelphia, what you end up with is General Burgoyne, who is moving south. He's the British general moving south from Canada. He's left out there on his own. The American forces occupy the Bemis Heights, which is an area of high ground that allows them to kind of dig in along the Hudson River, plant their artillery along that high ground, and really pin the British down. And eventually, Burgoyne is forced to surrender. This battle is a victory for the American colonists, but it's a victory internationally because it convinces the French. Remember, you still have Ben Franklin over there talking in the French's ear. It convinces the French that the American colonists might actually be able to win this, and thus we should support the Americans. This battle is what convinces the French to aid the Americans, and that's why this is arguably the most important battle of the American Revolution. So that's the second most important one. Thirdly, when you get to, let me scroll down here, when you get to Yorktown, I know I'm skipping through time, but I'm trying to cover the battles here sort of in sequential order. I've tried to sum it up as simply as I can for you. General Cornwallis surrenders and ends the American Revolution. Now, when this happens, basically the French alliance and Washington's force that is much improved after Valley Forge, they kind of come together and they work together in order to trap the British. So the French are going to blockade the Chesapeake Bay and prevent the British from retreating by sea. General Washington is going to blockade from the land. His army is going to dig in around Yorktown and slowly squeeze the British out. Eventually, Lord Cornwallis surrenders, and the Americans have won the American Revolution. Let me be very clear in saying this could not have happened without a French alliance. Ben Franklin's role inside of France was invaluable to convincing the French that the American cause is a cause that is possible and it's a cause worth fighting for. And oh, hey, on top of that, you, Mr. French, you hate the British. That's your arch rival. And if we can win, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, as a side note, you also have John Adams, who will be a later president of the United States. He's also in the Netherlands at this point. He's kind of working on getting loans from the Dutch, which he does get, and which ultimately helps Congress pay its soldiers to keep them in the field long enough to win this war. So that's also very, very important as well. So those are your three major important battles that you'll need to know. What else? I believe that is it. So tune back in for the third installment, which deals with the ending the war and who gets what after the war is over.